The Pacific Ocean in late 1942 was a graveyard of missed calculations, a vast blue expanse where the difference between life and death for an American sailor often came down to the terrifying inefficiency of manual mathematics performed under the duress of incoming fire, specifically the archaic necessity of the mechanical time fuse, which required a gunner to estimate the altitude of an enemy dive bomber, physically turn a ring on the nose of a 55-pound shell to set a timer, and then hope that the aircraft and the exploding projectile would intersect at the exact same millisecond in the infinite three-dimensional theater of the sky. For gunner's mate second class Thomas satisfyingly cranking the training wheel of a 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose gun mount aboard a cruiser in the Solomon Islands, the reality was a nightmare of wasted steel, because to destroy a Japanese Aichi D3A Val dive bomber with a standard time-fused shell required a direct hit or a detonation within a mathematically improbable margin of error, meaning thousands of rounds were expended to bring down a single aircraft, filling the air with black puffs of flak that trailed uselessly behind the agile Japanese pilots who danced through the barrage with contemptuous ease. While the sailors sweated in the tropical heat of the South Pacific, cursing the lag between the optical rangefinder's data and the physical setting of the fuse, a silent revolution was taking place thousands of miles away in a repurposed Chevrolet dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland, where Dr. Merle Tuve and the scientists of Section T, under the Office of Scientific Research and Development, were attempting to violate the laws of physics by placing a delicate radio transmitter inside the nose of an artillery shell. The challenge facing Section T was not merely theoretical, but brutally physical, as they needed to construct a vacuum tube, a fragile component usually made of glass and fine filaments found in living room radios, that could withstand the catastrophic violence of being fired from a cannon, a force of acceleration hitting 20,000 times the force of gravity, accompanied by a spin rate of 25,000 revolutions per minute, conditions that should, by all rights, turn any electronic device into dust. Through months of agonizing trial and error, dropping prototypes from airplanes and firing them vertically into cornfields, Tuve's team achieved the impossible by encasing tiny sub-miniature tubes in wax and plastic potting compounds that acted as a shock absorber, creating the T-32 ruggedized tube, the heart of the Mark 32 fuse, a device that turned a dumb artillery shell into a hunter-killer robot capable of emitting a continuous radio wave that would bounce off a target and reflect back to the shell, creating a Doppler shift ripple that triggered a thyrotron switch to detonate the explosive charge at the precise moment of maximum lethality, roughly 70 feet from the target. By December 1942, these secret Project A shells, designated VT for variable time to mislead enemy intelligence into thinking they were just another type of time fuse, arrived in the South Pacific under armed guard, treated with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, and were loaded into the magazines of the USS Helena, CL-50, a St. Louis-class light cruiser patrolling the violently contested waters off Guadalcanal. On the morning of January 5, 1943, the theory met reality when a flight of 4 Japanese Aichi D3A Vals dropped out of the sun, their fixed landing gear looking like predatory claws as they commenced their dive on the American task force, expecting the usual jagged wall of time-fused flak that they could slip through with practiced maneuvers. On the deck of the Helena, the 5-inch gun crews received the unprecedented order to eliminate the fuse setting step, a deviation from drill that felt unnatural to men trained to shout out time settings, and instead, they simply loaded the Mark 32 rounds into the hoists and fired. The first salvo left the muzzles with the standard concussive roar, tearing through the humid air at 2,600 feet per second. But unlike every shell fired in the history of naval warfare prior to this second, these projectiles were listening for the radio reflection of the Japanese aluminum. High above the ship, the lead Japanese pilot, focused on his dive angle, did not see a shell fly past him, nor did he see a shell hit him. Instead, a 5-inch projectile sensing the presence of his fuselage detonated prematurely by traditional standards, but perfectly by electronic ones, filling the air around his cockpit with high-velocity jagged steel fragments, not from a direct impact,
but from a proximity burst that shredded his control surfaces and killed the pilot instantly, without the shell ever touching the skin of the aircraft. The valve did not smoke or spiral, it simply ceased to fly, crumbling in midair as if swatted by an invisible hand, plunging into the sea, while the second shell in the salvo claimed the wingmen in an equally abrupt and confusing disintegration, leaving the surviving Japanese pilots stunned by the absence of the black puffballs they used to gauge distance, unaware that the Americans had just fundamentally altered the geometry of war by removing the human variable from the kill chain.
By the morning of June 19, 1944, the air over the Philippine Sea had become a humid theater for the greatest carrier battle in history, a clash of industrial titans that would come to be known grimly as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But for Lieutenant Jiro, a veteran aviator of the Imperial Japanese Navy leading a distinct Chutai of A6M50 fighters, the sky was simply a familiar office of death, where he relied on the rapidly depleting currency of his own skill to survive against the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Americans. Jiro was a survivor of the old breed, a man who had flown since the early days of the China incident, and he possessed an intuitive understanding of American anti-aircraft fire, which he viewed as a rhythmic, predictable environmental hazard. Clumsy walls of black smoke generated by time-fused shells that exploded at preset altitudes, creating layers of turbulence that a disciplined pilot could slip through by aggressively jinking his aircraft and changing altitude faster than the sluggish American gunners could crank their setting rings. As Jiro's formation climbed to 20,000 feet, vectoring toward the radar signatures of Task Force 58, he signaled his wingmen, green pilots barely out of flight school who gripped their sticks with white-knuckled terror, to stay loose and watch for the telltale muzzle flashes from the ships below that would precede the flak bursts by several seconds, unaware that the rules of engagement had fundamentally shifted inside the gray steel belly of the USS Enterprise. Deep within the carrier's fire control center, the atmosphere was one of cold, electrified precision as the gunnery officers received the authorization that had been withheld for years due to the fear of a dud shell falling into enemy hands and revealing the secret, the absolute release of VT fuses for high-altitude anti-aircraft defense. The 5-inch 38 caliber mounts turned in unison, guided not just by eyes, but by the Mk-37 director and its radar, tracking the incoming raid with a mechanical indifference that contrasted sharply with the sweat-drenched tension in Jiro's cockpit. As the Japanese squadron began their attack run, the American loaders slammed the Mark 53 rounds, an upgraded version of the earlier Mark 32, into the breaches, and the instant the guns fired, the massive inertial setback of the launch shattered a small glass ampule of electrolyte inside the fuse's battery, instantly activating the wet cell power source and waking up the oscillating detector in the nose cone while the shell was still traveling up the rifled barrel. Jiro saw the muzzle flashes from the Enterprise and the ring of escorting battleships and instinctively banked left, waiting for the usual delay and the chaotic scattering of explosions that he could thread. But the sky that day did not behave as physics dictated it should. Instead of a curtain of flak appearing at a fixed altitude, the shells pursued them like sentient predators, each one emitting a continuous radio frequency that formed a lethal sensitivity pattern roughly the shape of a pear around the projectile. When the first shell passed within 70 feet of Jiro's wingman, the radio waves bounced off the aluminum skin of the Zero and returned to the fuse's receiver with a slightly altered frequency due to the Doppler effect caused by the relative speed of the meeting objects, a signal that screamed target to the simple vacuum tube brain inside the steel casing. There was no need for a direct hit. The thyrotron tube triggered the electrical detonator, and the shell exploded instantly, casting a high-velocity annular ring of fragmentation that sawed through the Zero's right wing spar and fuel tank, turning the plane into a fireball that simply ceased to exist as an aerodynamic object. Jiro watched in horror as his formation was dismantled not by the lucky shots of expert marksmen, but by a mathematical certainty. For every time a shell got close, it detonated, creating a terrifying efficiency
where the randomness of survival was replaced by the certainty of destruction. He pulled his stick back, climbing hard, expecting the flak to thin out as the gunners struggled to recalculate the range. But the VT shells required no calculation of time, only a calculation of direction, and the explosions tracked him upward with impossible fidelity. The turkey shoot was not just a result of superior American pilots, but of this silent slaughter from below, where Japanese aviators trained to dodge bullets found themselves unable to dodge a proximity field that extended the lethal radius of every shell by a factor of 10. Jiro managed to dive away, his canopy cracked by a stray fragment, shaking uncontrollably as he retreated toward his carrier, his mind unable to process the new reality where the empty space around his plane was just as dangerous as the solid steel of the shells themselves, leaving him with the chilling realization that the Americans had somehow taught their ammunition to think.
By the autumn of 1944, the desperate logic of the Pacific War had curdled into the ritualized suicide of the Tokot Doctrine, transforming the conflict from a contest of strategy into a collision between spiritual fanaticism and industrial automation, embodied perfectly in the final morning of Ensign Tanaka, a 20-year-old university student turned pilot who sat in the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M50 at Mabalacat Airfield in the Philippines, a white hachimaki tied around his helmet and a small doll from his sister tucked into his flight suit, preparing to become a guided missile that possessed the one thing no American machine could replicate, a human soul willing to die for a hit. Tanaka's briefing had been explicit and grimly optimistic, instructing him that the American warships were bristling with guns, but handicapped by the limitations of human gunners who panicked under the stress of a diving plane, leading to the tactical doctrine that if a pilot maintained a wildly erratic flight path, jinking and skidding until the final 300 meters, he could slip inside the turning radius of the heavy guns and crash his explosive-laden aircraft into the bridge or flight deck before the flak could find him. As Tanaka roared down the runway and climbed into the haze over the late Gulf, he believed in the purity of his purpose and the infallibility of his evasion tactics, unaware that the destroyer USS Kidd, steaming as a picket guard on the horizon, had just cracked open crates marked with deceptive codes to reveal the golden bullets, the fully integrated stockpile of Mark 53 VT fuses, which were no longer a scarce experiment, but the standard ammunition for the fleet's 5-inch 38 caliber batteries. On the bridge of the Kidd, the detection of the incoming bogey did not trigger the frantic visual searching of earlier years, but rather a cold procedural handoff to the Mark 37 gunfire control system, a massive electromechanical computer deep inside the ship that slewed the turrets with a terrifying speed, locking on to Tanaka's aircraft while it was still miles away. As Tanaka began his attack run, initiating a violent series of S-turns designed to throw off the aim of optical sights, he felt a surge of adrenaline, watching the tracers from the 20mm and 40mm guns arc harmlessly behind him, confirming his belief that he was moving too fast for them to track. But the 5-inch guns were not tracking him with eyes, they were tracking him with radar, and firing shells that did not care about his erratic maneuvers because they did not need to hit him to kill him. The first salvo from the Kidd erupted from the barrels, and as the shells climbed to meet the diving Zero, the miniature radio transceivers in their nose cones woke up, spinning at 25,000 RPM, sending out a continuous wave signal that created a spherical zone of sensitivity around each projectile. Tanaka saw the muzzle flashes and braced for the usual flak bursts to appear behind him, but suddenly, the air 500 yards in front of the ship turned into a wall of violently expanding steel as a VT shell sensed the proximity of his engine block. The fuse's circuit, detecting the Doppler shift from the closing velocity of the aircraft, fired the electrical detonator at the precise millisecond required to place Tanaka inside the annulus of destruction, a lethal donut-shaped pattern of high-velocity shrapnel that expanded outward perpendicular to the shell's trajectory. Tanaka never completed his final dive. One moment he was screaming a prayer to the Emperor, and the next, a shell that had technically missed him by 60 feet detonated,
sending a jagged fragment of casing through the canopy plexiglass and into the flight controls, while hundreds of other shards shredded the Zero's wings, severing the hydraulic lines and igniting the fuel tanks. The plane did not explode in a glorious ball of fire immediately, but rather disintegrated structurally, the wings folding upward as if the spar had turned to liquid, the fuselage tumbling end over end in a chaotic ruin of physics that defied the pilot's spiritual will. To the crew on the USS Kidd, there was no romance in the kill, only the dull thump of the guns and the sight of the attacker dissolving into a cloud of debris long before it could threaten the ship, a brutal testament to the fact that against the electronic brain of the VT Fuze, the courage of the kamikaze was mathematically irrelevant, reduced to a blip on a radar screen that cost less than a pair of shoes. The ocean swallowed the wreckage of Ensign Tanaka, and the guns immediately slewed to the next target, repeating the cycle of automated slaughter with a mechanical indifference that signaled the end of the era of heroic individuality in aerial warfare.
By the middle of April 1945, the waters north of Okinawa had ceased to be a battlefield and had transformed into a slaughterhouse of unprecedented industrial density, specifically at Radar Picket Station No. 1, a lonely patch of ocean 50 miles north of the main invasion fleet, where the destroyer USS Laffey sat as a sacrificial technological tripwire intended to absorb the fury of the Kikusui, or floating chrysanthemum waves, before they could reach the vulnerable transport ships anchored at Hagushi. On the morning of April 16th, the radar screens in the Laffey's Combat Information Center glowed with the terrifying phosphorescence of 50 incoming bogies, a swarm of death that represented the apex of Japanese desperation. But for Lieutenant Commander Beckton on the bridge, the defense of his ship relied not on maneuvering, but on the sheer chaotic volume of fire generated by the 6 5-inch 38 caliber guns that had been stocked to capacity with Mark 53 VT fuses. High above in the gray overcast, a Japanese squadron leader piloting a Yokosuka D4Y Judy looked down on the solitary American destroyer and signaled his formation to attack, believing that a single ship could never track so many simultaneous vectors, unaware that he was diving into an airspace that the Americans were about to render physically uninhabitable through the saturation of proximity-fused steel. As the Japanese planes peeled off into their dives, coming from all points of the compass in a coordinated attempt to overwhelm the gunnery directors, the Laffey's main battery opened fire with a cadence that sounded like a continuous drum roll, expending ammunition at a rate that would have been impossible with old mechanical time fuses, because the loaders no longer had to pause to wrench a setting ring, allowing them to ram shells into the breaches as fast as the tray could cycle. The result was a visual phenomenon that shattered the psychological composure of the Japanese pilots: walking bursts. The squadron leader watched in disbelief as a stream of gray-black explosions didn't just appear at a fixed point, but actually tracked the flight path of his wingman's plane, moving with it like a shadow made of fire. Because as the radar-controlled guns followed the target, the VT fuses automatically detonated the instant they sensed the aircraft, creating a continuous hose of fragmentation that chased the plane across the sky until it inevitably intersected. He saw a Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber attempt a low-level approach, usually a safe zone against heavy flak which struggled with sea clutter, but the improved Mark 53 fuses had been hardened against wave reflection, and as the Kate leveled out, a 5-inch shell passed 20 feet above its canopy and detonated purely on proximity, the downward blast of shrapnel crushing the pilot into his instrument panel and sending the plane cartwheeling into the sea without a direct hit ever being scored. The sky around the Laffey became a chaotic storm of radio waves and high-velocity steel, a three-dimensional minefield where skill was rendered obsolete because the lethal radius of the American defense was no longer a point, but a sphere of influence that overlapped to form a solid wall. The squadron leader found himself screaming commands that went unanswered because his subordinates were simply vanishing, not merely being damaged, but being erased from the air by the kinetic energy of shells that weighed 55 pounds and exploded with the force of a freight train. When he finally committed his own aircraft to the dive, the terror was not the fear of death, but the realization of total impotence.
Seeing the flashes of the guns and knowing that thousands of tiny vacuum tubes were currently sensing his speed and trajectory, calculating his demise with a speed no human reflex could match. The Laffy took hit after hit, her superstructure burning and her guns jamming, yet the VT fuses kept the swarm at bay just enough to prevent total annihilation, turning what should have been a triumphant sinking into a Pyrrhic grinding match where the ocean's surface was littered with the aluminum confetti of dozens of Japanese aircraft. As the squadron leader's plane was finally caught in the overlapping blast waves of two simultaneous proximity detonations, his final cognitive process was the shattering understanding that the divine wind could not blow against a wall of science that had solved the geometry of killing so perfectly that it left no room for luck, courage, or honor. The air war had ended not with a dogfight, but with a calculation, leaving the Laffy broken but afloat in a sea of debris, a smoking monument to the fact that the relentless application of American physics had finally broken the back of the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm.
The silence that settled over Tokyo in September 1945 was heavier than the noise of the bombardment that had preceded it. A stifling quiet born of exhaustion and the total incineration of a capital city, where the wood and paper homes of the populace had been reduced to vast plains of gray ash. But within the surviving concrete shell of the Navy Ministry building, a different kind of excavation was taking place, as the officers of the U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan sat across from their former adversaries to conduct the autopsy of an empire. In a dim interrogation room stripped of imperial regalia, Commander Roberts, an American technical intelligence officer, placed a heavy cutaway section of a 5-inch projectile on the table, the metal cold and clean against the scarred wood, watching the reaction of Captain Genda, a surviving architect of the Japanese Naval Air Arm, whose face remained a mask of stoic defeat, yet whose eyes betrayed a lingering confusion regarding the catastrophic attrition of his pilots during the final 18 months of the war. The dialogue that followed revealed the depth of the technological abyss that had separated the two belligerents, for when Roberts asked Genda to explain the Imperial Navy's assessment of American anti-aircraft fire after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese officer admitted that the sudden exponential increase in lethality had been a source of terrifying speculation among the air staff, who could not comprehend how American gunners had suddenly become preternaturally accurate, hitting maneuvering targets with a consistency that defied the statistical probability of standard ballistics. Genda explained that their intelligence bureaus had grasped at straws, theorizing that the Americans were using some form of magnetic attraction that pulled the shells toward the aircraft, or perhaps a heat-seeking device similar to the primitive experiments conducted in German laboratories, because the concept of the truth was simply too scientifically advanced to be considered a tactical reality. They believed it was impossible to fit a radar set, which in the Japanese Navy was a piece of equipment the size of a refrigerator, requiring fragile glass vacuum tubes and heavy power supplies, into the nose of a spinning artillery shell. Roberts listened, then silently pointed to the nose of the cutaway shell on the table, tapping the tiny glass ampule of the battery and the ruggedized sub-miniature tubes embedded in their wax potting, explaining that the magic was not magnetism, but the brute force of American industrial engineering applied to the Doppler effect, a revelation that caused Genda to pick up the device with trembling hands as he realized that the divine wind had not been defeated by superior warrior spirit, but by the mass production of miniature electronics. The narrative lens pulls back from this intimate moment of realization to the broader, omniscient history, assessing the staggering scale of the VT Fuze program, known as Section T, which had consumed over $1 billion, a figure rivaling the Manhattan Project, and mobilized 80,000 workers across the United States, from the assembly lines of Sylvania to the labs of Johns Hopkins, to produce over 22 million fuses by the war's end. The historical data confirms what the Japanese pilots felt in their final moments. The VT fuse was calculated to be 3 to 5 times more effective than time fuses against high-altitude aircraft and lethal against the V-1 buzz bombs over London.
effectively neutralizing the two greatest asymmetric threats of the Axis powers, the kamikaze and the cruise missile, by rendering the airspace around Allied assets mathematically impenetrable. The funny fuse had done more than just shoot down planes. It had fundamentally altered the relationship between man and war, marking the transition from the era of the marksman, where the human eye and reflex were the primary arbiters of the kill, to the era of the system operator, where the human's role was to serve as a machine that possessed the sensory autonomy to destroy the enemy on its own terms. As the interrogation concluded and the American Gs drove through the ruined streets of Tokyo, the legacy of the proximity fuse became clear. While the atomic bomb would forever dominate the headlines as the weapon that ended the war, it was the humble, unheralded proximity fuse, a device of glass and physics that could survive being shot from a cannon, that had actually won the war, preserving the fleet that delivered the final blow, and proving that in the 20th century, the greatest weapon was not the courage to die, but the intelligence to engineer a shell that knew exactly when to kill.